Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to dive into a pretty fascinating etymological mystery together. We're looking at a word that billions of people use today, a word that genuinely feels like a cornerstone of global history. But as you're about to see, it actually began its life as a first-century insult. So let's jump right in.
To really solve this mystery, we have to look past our modern assumptions. When we hear this word today, it carries a lot of weight, respect, and just a massive historical legacy. But words have beginnings, right? And those beginnings are often pretty messy. We have to ask ourselves, who actually coined this term? And why in the world did they feel the need to invent it in the first place?
Our detective work today is grounded entirely in our source material, specifically Volume 7 of the Biblical Encyclopedia. If you turn to page 156, it meticulously traces the exact historical footprints of this word. We're going to rely heavily on this to sort of strip away centuries of tradition and get right back to the exact moment this word was born.
Section 1. The word's rare early usage. Let's start with a genuinely surprising fact about how frequently this word was actually used in the primary texts of the early believers.
3. That is it. The term Christian or Christians appears an incredibly rare 3 times in the entire New Testament. Now, what's really interesting about this tiny number is what it implies. If you assumed that the early founders of this movement proudly walked around using this title for themselves, well, the data simply doesn't support that. 3 mentions across dozens of documents tells us that this was absolutely not their preferred way of identifying themselves.
Section 2. Who actually coined it? So, since the word was used so rarely by the early authors themselves, we kind of have to use the process of elimination to figure out who actually invented it. Let's look at the usual suspects. First, the Jewish population. Did they coin it? Well, no. Due to the intense religious animosity at the time, they preferred to use the label Sect of the Nazarenes. They absolutely weren't going to use a word rooted in the title of Christ or Messiah for this group. And what about the believers themselves? Well, they simply used internal terms, things like disciples, believers, or sometimes brothers. So the crucial point here is that neither the religious establishment of the day nor the actual members of the movement invented this word. And this brilliantly illustrates where external labels usually come from. The true inventors of the word were actually the pagan inhabitants of Antioch. Now, Antioch was this major, bustling, cosmopolitan Roman city. The locals there started noticing a new, predominantly Gentile group that had separated from the traditional Jewish synagogue. The people of Antioch just needed a new name to describe this very specific, peculiar group of people living in their city. Section 3. Born out of mockery. Because here is the big twist. The pagans of Antioch did not create this label as a compliment. Not at all.
Just think about the first century context of Antioch for a second. Because these early believers were constantly talking about Christ. It was the absolute center of their message, their daily lives, their conversations. The local pagans basically slapped them with this title. It was essentially like calling them the Christ people, or, Christers. It fundamentally carried this tone of mockery, derision, and just plain annoyance. It's a lot like getting a sarcastic, slightly mean nickname in high school based on that one thing you absolutely won't stop talking about. It was a caricature of their obsession.
Our source material points us to the exact historical moment, which is recorded in Acts chapter 11. It says the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. Notice the passive phrasing there, were called. They didn't call themselves this. The name was attached to them by outsiders. This is the precise geographical and historical birthplace of the term. To see how this builds, we really just have to listen to the political figures of the day. We can actually hear the mocking, derogatory nature of the word in the first century through the specific quote. This is King Agrippa's response to the Apostle Paul. Paul is on trial, he's passionately making his case, and the king replies, "You almost persuaded me to become a Christian." This wasn't earnest at all. This was a king sarcastically using a street slur. He's essentially scoffing, "Do you really think you can talk me into becoming one of those mocked Christ people so easily?" And if we look at the Apostle Peter's writings, we see even more confirmation that bearing this name was tied to immense social pressure. He writes, "If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed." You don't tell someone not to be ashamed unless the word they are being called is inherently shameful. The word was basically a mechanism for marginalization, right? It was a tool used to single them out for suffering, certainly not a badge of prestige. Section 4. Reclaiming a historical identity. So, how in the world did a local slur tied to shame become a worldwide identity marker?
Well, the early believers did not accept this name with open arms at first. It wasn't some overnight rebranding campaign. But as our source outlines, over the passing days, months, and years, it simply stuck to them. When society constantly calls you something, eventually you have to decide how you're going to respond to it. Their response was one of reluctant and then eventual acceptance.
This timeline perfectly maps out the word's incredible evolution. We start in the 1st century, where it's coined as a local street slur in Antioch. Then, still in that same century, it elevates slightly, but only to be used mockingly by royalty, like King Agrippa. But look at the shift into the 2nd century. It gets adopted by early leaders like Ignatius of Antioch, and then, crucially, it is officially recognized by the Roman Empire itself in the correspondence between Pliny and Trajan.
Let's look a little closer at this 2nd century official shift, because it changes absolutely everything. Ignatius of Antioch becomes the first leader to officially and positively call the believers Christians in his writings. Then, it actually enters the Roman legal system. Roman governor Pliny writes a famous letter to Emperor Trajan asking how to handle this group, and he officially charges people under the name Christians. It was at this exact moment that the word permanently entered the historical record. The believers reclaimed the slur and they became historically famous by this very name. What began as an insult was now their official, undeniable identity in the eyes of the greatest empire on earth.
It is absolutely incredible to think about how a derogatory slur, coined in the bustling streets of ancient Antioch, managed to transform over just a few generations into one of the most globally recognized words in human history. It really makes you look at language completely differently. Because if a word with that much profound historical weight started out as a literal joke, it leaves you wondering, what are the hidden origins of the other words we use every single day? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.